Hello and welcome to Narrative. I'm so excited about today's podcast. It's the first time Cheri, Jacobus and I have collaborated on an investigation. And tonight, we'll solve one of the biggest political mysteries around. Did Russia help Donald Trump to win the 2016 election? You think you know, but do you? Thanks to BetterHelp for supporting tonight's investigation. For 10% off your first month, go to betterhelp.com/Zev. That's betterhelp.com/Zev. Start living a better life today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday night's Narrative Live. It's so good to be with you tonight. Here with Cheri Jacobus. How are you tonight, Cheri? Nice to see you again.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited because we're premiering something tonight we've decided to do called Mueller's Lost Files, inspired by your incredible feed. Because every time I look at your feed on Twitter, it's always got some interesting little bits and pieces from the Mueller report that have not been followed up on. And I was thinking we should really follow up on that. So that's what tonight's
Because I never thread them. I just sort of shoot them out there, you know.
However it works. I'm on your feed a lot.
Good. I encourage everyone to be on my feed a lot.
Exactly, and everyone should follow you indeed. Now, you're known as a former Republican strategist amongst many other great things, but as well, you are also the executive producer of America Reads the Mueller Report, which you did on public access television and also on, mostly, that's right, that's public access television or shows like that, right, or networks like that?
Actually, we did it on Sinclair. Okay. We actually produced, it was a half-hour reading of the highlights of the Mueller Report. I had celebrities and a few real people, and we had it produced in Hollywood, pretty much all volunteer, and we bought half-hour time slots on local TV, right. But just, regular local TV where you could get a half hour, including Sinclair. And we did it in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and, Michigan and places like that.
Trying to get the Mueller report out to the middle of the country. It's interesting you mentioned Sinclair because Boris Epstein comes up in today's show. We'll talk about that a little later on. But it's also because of your executive production of that show that you're the most suitable person to have on a show that looks back at the Mueller report and looks at some of the highlights and looks at some of the loose threads that maybe were left behind. And tonight we're going to be looking at two instances that are kind of interesting. One involves George Nader, the Republican or Trump advisor who also worked for the UAE and the Saudi Arabians, as well as maybe Israel, and his recent guilty plea related to funding the Hillary Clinton campaign. But also we're going to talk about an interesting case which involved an ABC News producer who might have handed over the results of exit polling on election day to the Republican campaign, the Trump campaign, and he may have helped them win that election.
Yeah.
So just briefly tell us what that story is about, and then we'll jump back into the news.
Well, this was interesting because it was something that came out. It was actually in the book that Corey Lewandowski and Dave Bossie, Citizens United fame, and he was the deputy campaign manager for the Trump campaign in 2016. They co-wrote a book, and in it, they talked about how on election night, Dave Bossie's good buddy, Chris Vlasto of ABC News, called them at 5:01 on election night. Now, there's a consortium of media that all get together and they pay for exit polling. At 5 o'clock, they get it. They are sworn to secrecy. It is not to be shared with anyone for obvious reasons. So what does Chris Vlasto do at 5:01? He calls Dave Bossie at the Trump campaign on election night and said, you guys have a long night ahead of you. You lost, and here's where you lost. And it was the expected places where Hillary was ahead in the polls. And this news was conveyed to Reince Priebus and I guess Manafort and Kushner and then to Trump. And he apparently turned to Melania and said, we lost. Looks like we lost. They're telling us we lost. That in and of itself is pretty bad that somebody from the media was sharing this. Mm-hmm. And Chris Vlasto, as you know, you may know, I think you've read this, he goes back with Bossie back to the days of the Monica Lewinsky and the Clinton impeachment. He was the point guy that did a bunch of stuff on this and reported on it and produced a lot of stuff for ABC News. So as a result of him helping the Trump campaign in 2016, he was going to be the communications director. And apparently Jason Miller had a problem with this because he wanted to be the communications director.
Right.
And he became the communications director, and he now is still with Trump, as we know. So that's how all these guys start, jockeying for jobs. Well, ABC News did, I guess Vlasto got a slap on the wrist, but he was then promoted. So he's doing just fine. But the whole point of that, when you got the exit polling, when you put that up against what we know from the Mueller report, that Paul Manafort basically had Klimnik, who he'd worked with, the Russian worked with forever, get the early internal polling data to Putin. And that's where there was collusion and conspiracy. That's where they were working with Russia to help Russia help Trump, to interfere in our elections in 2016 to help Trump. So not only did Russia have the early internal polling data, which at that point would have shown them kind of where they needed to get ready to go when they got more information. Now, also remember,
you're giving away too much of the story. You might want to stop there because we're going to go through all of this a little later on. That's a good setup, though. That is a good setup because it gets really interesting, and we're going to get into the weeds of it. And it's really fascinating as we look at what Vlasto did that day. I've been on the receiving end of some of those exit polling. It sure was a no-no to phone anybody from a campaign, release any information when I got them. And I'm sure he was aware of that, too, when he made that phone call. But, we'll find out what the reasoning was, hopefully, at some point during tonight's show. Let's get into the news, though, because there is a lot of news from the Select Committee investigating January the 6th on the Hill. They have released 4 new subpoenas today. Well, these aren't the biggest name, but I'm going to go with him first. I find him fascinating. Boris Epstein is amongst the people who I thought had sort of left the Trump orbit in the last few years, but apparently has re-emerged. We remember him from 2016. He's a Russian-American, I think might be still closely aligned to some Russian interests. But the Select Committee's investigation has revealed credible evidence that he publicly promoted claims that the 2020 election was stolen and participated in attempts to disrupt or delay the certification of the election result. It says here that you, meaning Boris, participated in a press conference on November 19, 2020, during which attorneys for the Trump campaign promoted claims of election fraud. Published reports have placed you at meetings at the Willard Hotel, this is really interesting. So he was at the Willard Hotel in the War Room on the days leading up to January the 6th. And you are reported of having participated in a call with former President Trump on the morning of January the 6th, during which options were discussed to delay the certification of election results in light of Vice President Pence's unwillingness to deny or delay certification. That puts him right in the middle of the action, both at the Willard Hotel and as being discussing strategy with Trump on the morning of.
Yeah, and obviously that's what they're getting at. And of course, we know him from being the top political guy at Sinclair for a long time. But so they're going at the people who had conversations with Trump as close to the time as possible to the attack on the Capitol. They need to know what those conversations were, what was going on in the planning. They want their phone records. And this is, Boris is one of those guys. He's a longtime Trumper, Trump aide in the Trump orb. So he would be someone who would have, I would say it's likely that he would be somebody who would have direct contact with Trump throughout this entire ordeal. And so that's why he's of interest, obviously. And it appears that some of the other names fall into that category as well. These are people who, if they were at the Willard, they're in touch with Trump and they have something to offer. So they're going to plead the fifth or they'll lie. They're going to stall. So, but at least the committee is trying to get at these people, even if DOJ appears, from the experts that know how this stuff goes, to not be doing quite that.
Yeah, we know that on the days leading up to January the 6th, the Willard Hotel was where they were trying to convince all the Republican congressmen and senators to jump on board this delay scheme, this stop the steal scheme of not certifying these election results. So it's interesting that he was involved there in the days leading up to January the 6th, and then also on the morning of, which means they were fully aware at this point Vice President Pence was not going to do what they wanted him to do. So they were planning what? Planning an insurrection, a violent coup? What were they planning? It really does begin to beg that question.
Sure. And you can tell by the language that Steve Bannon uses exactly what they wanted them to do. So what they're doing now is saying, well, okay, if all these people who are clearly in touch with Trump during this time, they all knew what the plan was. So did Trump.
Or did Trump order it even? Yeah, it certainly begs that question. So off to Rudy Giuliani. It took him a while to get subpoenaed. I'm surprised it took this long. They say about Rudolph Giuliani here, the Select Committee's investigation has revealed credible evidence, yada, yada, yada. We know that part already. And it says between mid-November 2020 and January the 6th, 2021, and thereafter, You actively promoted claims of election fraud on behalf of former President Trump and sought to convince state legislators to take steps to overturn the election results, according to witness testimony and public reporting. In December 2020, you urged President Trump to direct the seizure of voting machines around the country. That's really interesting that he did that, after being told that the Department of Homeland Security had no lawful authority to do so. According to public reporting on January 6th and in the days prior, you were in contact with then President Trump and members of Congress regarding strategies for delaying or overturning the results of the 2020 election. So that point there, I think I knew this, but I wasn't sure I knew this, that Rudy was the one who urged President Trump to direct for the seizure of voting machines around the country.
Right. And I think somebody else was probably joining in on that. But I don't know, Zeb, it seems to me, and I've worked on Capitol Hill and I worked for a committee that had an oversight subcommittee. So I know a little bit about how these investigations go. And you do want to get to the truth and everything, but they also know the impact that it has to make their point. So I'm guessing that they will get all of the stuff that we already know, that Trump was in touch with these people. Clearly, there's records of this. But to get it all together in one point and then to put it out there with, this big, long list of all of the people that Trump was talking to who were all involved in this sedition, in this planning. And so it's not just a little one-off here or this little detail that leaks out a couple months later. I think if the committee puts it out there, one big wave, so that it's really kind of hard for anybody other than the cult to sort of beat that back, they will be able to make their point. At that point, does DOJ do something? We have Adam Schiff saying they should not be waiting for the committee, that's not how these things are supposed to go. It might make it a little easier. I mean, those are the unanswered questions right now.
Well, I mean, look, they're obviously investigating a seditious conspiracy. You can't have that seditious conspiracy not involving all these people unless you're just going to investigate a portion of it. So, they have to be investigating it. Whether they're going to take action is a whole other question. Right. I'm just fascinated by this idea that I've never heard of anyone urging the president of the United States to seize voting machines around the country. And we know this was their plans, but I can't believe that Rudy Giuliani did that. Someone at Homeland Security must have told him, you actually can't do that. But still, that's pretty stunning.
But Zev, when you look at the other things that were happening as well, I mean, who would have thought that he installed Louis DeJoy at the post office? And when the voting machines were improved since 2016, and because of the pandemic, so many people were voting by mail, paper ballots, which makes it harder to cheat. They panicked. And that's when they blatantly, we have Louis DeJoy basically removing mailboxes so that people could not easily
and mail sorters.
Mail in
Remember
their
the mail sorters?
Yes,
at
and
post
taking
offices?
apart, dismantling $2 million machines, the mail sorting machines, so that if the mail couldn't be sorted in time, they'd miss the deadline and the votes, that's basically stalling it. So those paper ballots, those mail-in votes could not be counted. So to say that Rudy Giuliani was advising Trump to seize the voting machines, that doesn't surprise me a bit. No. Because look what we already know that they were doing out in the open when they panicked. And that's what happened with Louis DeJoy.
It seems to be so much panicking. It seems to me that they kept trying to do things and then things got worse and worse. And every time they try to cover up something that happened before, they pushed it to another level until you land up with 5 people dead as a result of an insurrection. I mean, it just seems like everything was very poorly thought out, at least, but there was clearly a lot of planning involved.
Yeah, and different factions doing different things, and how much Trump knew about or kind of knew about, or maybe he knew the overall plan, but they might have made sure to at least not put it directly next to him. You remove it by a person or two, but everybody kind of was, like Bannon was in on the plan. And let's not forget, there were pipe bombs planted at the RNC and the DNC, and who knows, it was actually behind the Capitol Hill Club. Somebody found it by accident, and they had a timer on them. And so they immediately said, okay, we better check out the DNC, and they went there, and that pipe bomb was there. Then Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was at the DNC building. So that's frightening that could happen, because you're wondering, where was her Secret Service detail? What did they do during the advance sweep, which every Secret Service would do prior to their subject, the person they're protecting, entering, especially her on a day like that, entering the building. And so somehow this was missed. Who is not part of her Secret Service detail went looking for it. They found it, because since they had found one behind the RNC, they assumed that there's probably one by the DNC, and they were correct. But her Secret Service detail did not find it.
It's so fascinating. To me, it just says so much about where we are in American politics when you've got people on the legitimate, official, main party in American politics at least aligned to or adjacent to what are clearly terrorist attacks or attempted terrorist attacks. And there's no other way to describe those things. It's really kind of shocking.
Well, and everybody that's supporting it, that's what shocks me. And I worked in this industry for so long as a Republican. I'm very familiar with the Capitol Hill Club and the RNC building. And, I know all of this. And so to see my former party latch onto this, it's chilling. It's not an idea that I've ever gotten used to. It is as upsetting to me today in 2022 as it was in 2015 when I first started catching on what was going on. I was an early victim of some of this stuff. So I knew some of this before other people did. So maybe I'm not as surprised as you are.
I'm not surprised, but it is just shocking. You can't get used to this kind of thing when you've got a party like this involved, at least adjacent to terrorist attacks. It's just impossible to understand how. Sidney Powell, boy, am I glad to see someone subpoena her. A lawyer she is not, but officially she claims to be. And apparently, according to the January 6th committee, between mid-November 2020 and January the 6th, 2021, and thereafter, you actively promoted claims of election fraud on behalf of former President Trump in litigation and public appearances. The Select Committee seeks the evidence you relied upon to make those claims. That's really important. They're seeking the underlying evidence. I don't think she has very much. According to public reporting in December 2020, you urged President Trump to direct the seizure of voting machines around the country to find evidence that foreign adversaries had hacked those machines and alerted the results of the election. So that's a big allegation against her. I think the stuff about looking for the underlying evidence is really interesting because she had wild claims. I mean, Venezuela, it was all these election voting machines and the stuff that was created by that Flynn associate in that PowerPoint presentation. We have real evidence to base her allegations on. But then there she is also asking the president to seize voting machines around the country to find evidence. It's not the president's job to do that, of course. It's the Department of Justice. If anyone was going to do that, I guess the Department of Justice would do it.
My guess is that Barr refused. He didn't want to have any parts of this. That's why he left at a very opportune time for him, so he could wash his hands of some of this. But, think of it this way, Zev. If they're going to force Sidney Powell to cough up evidence, but we know that she was advising Trump to do things, maybe some that he didn't do and some he did do, and if she can't cough up evidence to the committee, we know that they couldn't cough up any evidence in all the multiple courtrooms that they were in when they were challenging things. But that means that they can say, okay, Donald Trump, you did X or you ordered X based on no evidence because there isn't any.
Right.
And so it seems to me, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but it kind of seems to me that that's what they can do if they are going for him. If the committee, I think, will go for him unless they did cut a deal, as we read about today, if they're kind of wavering, thinking, oh no, because we heard Ted Cruz out there, now saying that they're going to impeach Biden for what he's done on COVID and stuff like that. So it's like, I think we have somebody else we can blame. The former guy.
Pull down all our election norms to absolutely chaos is really what they intend to do in avenging any sort of attempt to do anything to Trump. But what can the committee do actually to Trump? There's not much. They can say he did all these things, but without the DOJ acting, they don't have any teeth. Do they?
No, they don't. What they can do is they can put it out there so that as democracy is supposed to work and people go to the polls, they know what the party has done or not done. A lot of people voted Democrat, maybe for the first time in their life, so that Democrats would be able to clean this up and to get to the bottom of this. This is the worst political scandal, I think, in the history of our country, or certainly one of them. I mean, we've come so close to losing our democracy, and we may still. So they feel it's incumbent upon them to do this because this is their job, whether or not DOJ does their job or not. Maybe this will make it easier for DOJ, although it's not supposed to work like that, and there'd be no reason for them to have to wait for January 6th committee to act. So that's perplexing, and it is bipartisan. And so you can look at what the committee is doing. You can look at what your elected House member is or isn't doing, and then you can decide in November if they're doing the job that you sent them there to do or not. Right. So they're doing their job, and they're doing it in a timely fashion because the House is on a 2-year schedule. This is what their job is. It's what we elected them to do. And so I think that that's what they're doing. They're putting it out there because it's their duty.
One last of the subpoenas that came out today, Jenna Ellis, who is the lawyer of the Trump campaign, I believe that's her title, between mid-November 2020 and January the 6th, 2021, and thereafter, you actively promoted claims of election fraud on behalf of former President Trump and sought to convince state legislators to take steps to overturn the election results. According to public reporting, you prepared and circulated 2 memos purporting to analyze the constitutional authority for the vice president to reject or delay counting electoral votes from states that had submitted alternate slates of electors. Now, this was, nonsense, basically. She did prepare these memos. We had them on the show a few weeks ago. I mean, it's just nonsense what she wrote in there. These are theories and ideas that obviously made no sense. But in those memos, she does argue that the vice president has some sort of authority to delay the counting of the votes and to look at these alternate slate of electors. I mean, she's not a constitutional scholar, as far as I know. She's just a lawyer, but I don't think
obviously.
I don't think she's a deep-seated, she's not a Raskin, So I don't think you're getting a really good understanding of what the Constitution is in those memos, but it's shocking that, this kind of stuff even gets to the president of the United States when it's not verified and clearly not legal.
Yeah. The orders from the same place, maybe it did come from him. And obviously, the man who was president at that time and the man who was vice president at that time had differing opinions on this. And that's where we get to the real nut of this. And what conversations did they have and what went on in those conversations where they determined that they had differing opinions on this. And that's where they have to talk to Pence and find out what, did Pence say, look, I can't do this. This isn't right. This isn't legal. This is, it's ridiculous. And what did Trump say at that time? We know that Pence talked to Dan Quayle, who said, you can't do this,
When you're getting your legal advice from Jenna Ellis and Dan Quayle, you're in trouble. This is not a good look.
And then we know that it was to the point, and this is what I find really interesting, and I'm not trying to get ahead here in the discussion, but I keep focusing myself on that day and the fact that Mike Pence would not get in the car with the Secret Service. And they said, oh, well, it's because he didn't want the optics of him driving away and leaving it. No, he did not get in the car because he didn't trust them. He had already been locked out of their private offices in the Capitol, as we know. He had to have seen the gallows hanging out there, set up in the Capitol grounds. He knew enough to know that the fact that he was not going along with this scheme meant that his life was in danger. And at that point, he didn't know about the pipe bombs. But we know that Kamala Harris, the vice president-elect Kamala Harris, that day, her life was in danger. And again, this wasn't a bomb threat where somebody calls it in because they want something or they want to cause chaos. This was a bomb with a timer that was meant to go off.
Coming up, our investigation into the 2016 election. Did Russia help Donald Trump win? Hardly a week goes by without someone thanking us in the comments of the show for keeping them sane. Of course, it's meant lightheartedly, but these are very stressful times. And there is help. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy platform, making professional therapy accessible, affordable, and convenient. When you join BetterHelp, you'll be assigned your own licensed professional therapist in under 48 hours. Your sessions with your trusted therapist take place in a safe and private online environment. You don't need to drive anywhere or sit in an uncomfortable waiting room, and no one but you and your therapist needs to know. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches. So if you don't like your counselor, no problem. It's free and easy to switch counselors if needed. BetterHelp is more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is also available. Anything you share is confidential.
This is not a crisis line or self-help line. BetterHelp is professional counseling. BetterHelp is convenient, professional, and affordable. Start living a happier life today. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/Zev. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. That's BetterHelp, BETTER, help, HELP.com/Zev for 10% off your first month. Thank you, BetterHelp.
So this would have been an assassination. What we don't know is, I'm assuming, okay, if they were going after Pelosi and they were going after Pence to get rid of the line of secession, and we know that Grassley was on board because he was the old man, and Grassley was bragging the day before, Pence isn't going to be there, so he knew something. He just said the quiet part out loud.
Absolutely.
The stage, right. He read the stage direction, out loud. And so, he was in on this. But clearly, Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House, and the Vice President, Michael Pence, were in danger that day. We know that Kamala Harris was in danger that day. I think we can assume that Joe Biden, the president-elect, was also in danger that day. And it's something that others know about and they've been able to keep quiet, or maybe they haven't found it yet. But
we know he was certainly in danger in the days leading up to the inauguration. That was all our concern heading into that inauguration. So those days between the 6th and I think the 20th, whatever it was, that the inauguration took place, I mean, clearly there was a real threat on his life during that whole period of time. And so, it's a horrendous thing when you're thinking about what events took place in early January there. Yeah. Some people on the chat rooms want to say, Bossy, isn't it awful? Or sorry, isn't it amazing? Some of these names are common in our everyday experience now. Then they say awful. It is kind of amazing that these people stick around and they're all the same people all the time. Sharon says that you look like you've never been sick a day. Amazing, Cheri. And then
Thank you.
And then Marie adds that you look beautiful. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
There you go. Matt Foster says, for Powell, the underlying evidence is just Biden won. Indeed, I think that's basically, they were just trying to throw anything at the wall there. Certainly Powell seems to be the most unhinged of a lot of them.
Or the one that seems the most unhinged. I mean, Giuliani is, come on. I don't know. I mean, if it's a contest, it would be tough. But, these were the people who were surrounding the commander-in-chief at that time.
And Andrea says, you'd think that Pence would want to spill the beans when he realized he is expendable or not. I mean, if he still thought he was under threat. I mean, that's really the question, right? That's really what you're saying there, Cheri.
Yeah, I think that Pence was in danger, and he knew it that day. Pelosi was in danger. Kamala Harris was in danger, and I'm sure that Joe Biden was in danger. Mm-hmm. And that's just the part that hasn't gotten out yet. So they were attempting to assassinate all of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's clear from Pence's action that day and what we find out afterwards that he knew it. He knew it, which is why he would not get in the car. He also knew that they would just do it, Grassley would take over and they would do what they were going to do anyway. But I don't understand why he won't. Maybe he will eventually,
I think he's still quite fearful. I think it's a difficult position he's got himself into. Certainly, if he does, he's going to be the target of Trump and the Republican Party, and certainly his political career will be over if it isn't already. But, he's got to walk a fine line there. He can't just seem like he's flipping sides.
He's probably waiting for some other people to go down first so that he doesn't want to be a hero.
No, not in this case. Well, I think he may have been, actually. And Polina also says, I think AOC was in danger too. Didn't she hide behind the door of her office? Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead. She
was so recognizable, and if they found her, they would get her. And that was the case with, and Schumer being let out, running down the halls because the most recognizable people would have been killed. And they know it. And AOC is a very recognizable person, and, the Trumpers hate her. And so she was in danger, and probably at it being a scary situation for anybody, knowing that this was happening. And she, I guess, hid in her private bathroom in her congressional offices. But as it was happening very quickly, but at some point, someone told her she was in danger, but she's smart enough to think quickly and know that we're all in danger. But probably especially me if they find me.
Yeah, and that she was definitely on their list of people to get to that day and every day, frankly. So it's frightening. Everyone in that, when you look at all the video from that day, it was horrifying and terrifying for everyone, Republicans included. That's why they were so nervous and calling the president at the time and asking him to stop things. There was a general and genuine sense of fear on the Hill that day.
And those, they knew it. They had to know it was happening. Some knew it was going to happen, but they probably thought it was going to happen in a manner in which they would somehow be protected. But when you've got that kind of chaos and violence, and you've got people dying, like that breach, and they hear gunshots, then they know that they're not safe and that they're probably just, collateral damage.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's leave 2020 behind and let's go back to 2016 for our Bob Mueller lost files. Now, of course, we don't actually have Bob Mueller's lost files, but if we had imagined his lost files, it would include some of these stories that we're going to do in our investigation here around some of the events that happened in 2016. And, interesting throughout all of this is the notion that in 2016, clearly they tried to win the election illegally. They may have won it illegally. They may have cheated their way to an election in 2016 and election win. And they did clearly in 2020, they were trying to win the election illegally, and as they might do going forward. So it's interesting to go back to Mueller's files here because they are so revealing about the intentions and the strategies and the techniques of the Republican Party. They really don't seem like they have any interest in winning things legally. It's all about illegally winning the elections. And so we take us to the story of Chris Vlasto. He's an ABC News producer. He produces many, many things. We'll go through some of his incredible roster as a producer shortly. But let's go back to his history first before we introduce him as a character in this particular drama that you've surfaced from 2016. Firstly, you should know that Chris Vlasto is the grandson of the late Solon G. Vlasto. That's the guy at the top of this picture here. And he was the publisher of the Atlantis, one of the most successful Greek language daily newspapers published in the United States. Atlantis was founded by the guy on the very left of the screen. That's Solon G. Vlasto's uncle in 1894. So the guy on the very left is a bit of a hero in the Greek community in New York because he was also the founder of the Greek Orthodox Church in 1892 in New York City. And he was the founder of this Atlantis Greek daily. He was a big deal. And by all accounts, a lot of these immigrants who at the time were known as the Greek merchants who had family ties to the nobility of Chios, which is, of course, in Greece, the island of Chios, the most influential force in the New York Greek colony from the 1850s to the 1890s. They provided the emerging Greek community with leadership and direction. One of the most influential leaders was, in fact, Solon J. Vlasto, says one account of the period. It's interesting. He was a tough character, Mr. Vlasto was. He was also literally horsewhipped in the lobby of a local hotel by the wife of an employee he had fired.
Even worse.
Even worse. He also allegedly had an affair with the wife of a senator. That was not a good look for him, but he didn't mind because he said the scandal sold newspapers, so he was winning regardless. So now we fast forward 100 years, and his great-grandnephew, I think is what you'd call him, Chris Vlasto, is working at ABC News. He's also has an appetite for public sexual scandal, it seems, and he's now backed by the power of network TV news, which in that case was ABC News. And in January the 21st, 1998, Vlasto's great-grandnephew, as I mentioned, he produced Jackie Judd's reporting of a very big scandal. In fact, he was the guy responsible for the coverage of President Clinton's Monica Lewinsky affair scandal. He was the guy right in the middle of that, not just the guy covering the story from in terms of White House reaction, but the guy who actually got in touch with Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp and did all the interviews on behalf of Jackie Judd, and also later on Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters. Remember those interviews? Here's a little look of his work. This is the scandal as it broke on ABC News around this week, believe it or not, in 1998.
President Clinton faces allegations of asking a former White House intern to lie about their relationship. A very difficult day for the White House.
I didn't ask anybody not to tell the truth. There is no improper relationship. The allegations I have read are not true.
Pope John Paul II arrives in Cuba. A very good day for Cuba. Sam, stay with us for just a moment. We first learned about this story from ABC's Jackie Judd. She's been covering the Whitewater investigation led by the independent counsel, Kenneth Starr. And this report of hers tonight begins with the two women at the center of this story.
When Monica Lewinsky left the White House to work at the Pentagon, she became friends with this woman, Linda Tripp. And it is Tripp who months later brought Lewinsky to the attention of the independent counsel, Ken Starr. ABC News has learned that last summer, Tripp began recording her phone conversations with Lewinsky, in which the young woman allegedly spoke about her affair with Mr. Clinton and his efforts to convince her to lie to cover it up. Why would Tripp secretly tape their talks? She had earlier worked at the White House, and one source says she was angry when Mr. Clinton's attorney, Robert Bennett, called her a liar for claiming the president had made a pass at another White House aide. Why would Tripp go to Starr? Last month, both Tripp and Lewinsky were subpoenaed by lawyers in the Paula Jones sexual harassment lawsuit, who were looking for more evidence of sexual misconduct by the president. Lewinsky allegedly told Tripp that she was going to lie about the affair, and Tripp had to as well. Because Tripp knew independent counsel Starr and didn't trust the Justice Department to protect her, Tripp went to Starr with tapes of more than 10 calls with Lewinsky. Significantly, she also claims she had heard 3 messages from the president himself on Lewinsky's voicemail. It is unclear whether Starr has obtained those messages. ABC News also has learned that Starr's office and the FBI wired Tripp to record a conversation with Lewinsky and gave her equipment to tape more calls so that investigators could hear for themselves what had been in the earlier tapes. Lewinsky allegedly claims in the tapes that Mr. Clinton told her to deny their relationship to Jones's lawyers and to see Clinton confidant Vernon Jordan. According to a source who heard the tapes, Lewinsky says Jordan instructed her to lie under oath because lawyers never prosecute perjury in a civil case, and he promised her help in finding a new job. Jordan refused comment today. Sources tell ABC News that Jordan also helped Lewinsky find a lawyer who filed a sworn affidavit in which he did deny a sexual relationship with the president. Another lawyer, newly hired by Lewinsky's family, would not rule out that her story could change.
I am saying it would be irresponsible for me to make an absolute statement, and I have made no absolute statement until I complete this whole process.
Lewinsky is scheduled to be deposed on Friday by Paula Jones's attorneys. Sources say as of now, Peter, she plans on taking the 5th.
Jackie, one question on this subject of depositions. When the president was deposed last Saturday in the Paula Jones case, do we know whether he was asked about the Lewinsky affair, and if he was, what he said?
Yes, we've been led to believe that he was asked about this and that he denied having any sexual relationship with her.
Okay, thanks very much, Jackie Judd in Washington.
Nice to go back in that little capsule into that big scandal, which was, dominated all our lives back then. What are your memories of those days?
Well, Dave Bossie was a big player during all that. He had been on the House Oversight Committee for a while, so he's part of that world. That's how he knows Chris Vlasto.
And Rod Rosenstein as well.
And he was part of that.
He was part of the Star Committee team.
And George Conway.
Yeah, George
Conway, yeah. So, these are people that these are names that we have, people, some of them that I knew. I certainly known Dave Bossie for decades. So that's why what I find interesting is we didn't read about any of this in the Mueller report. And it wasn't until about election night 2016. It was the Lewandowski Dave Bossie book that they wrote together after that. And they talked about Chris Vlasto making that call to them at 5:01 on election night.
It's really fascinating.
Telling them that they had lost. Now, when you first of all remember that a whistleblower has said that Karl Rove allegedly told her that if a state is within 3 points, you can cheat undetected. Now, presumably that means you go in, the machines, you just take a few votes per precinct and no one's going to notice. So you put that on top of the fact that Paul Manafort had provided Vladimir Putin, essentially, with internal polling to kind of know where they knew their soft spots were going.
Let's look at the Vlasto. Let's go step by step here because I don't want us to run ahead a little bit. But this is the conversation you're talking about in Bossie's book, right? This is how they go back. So Vlasto says, "Are you sitting down?" Bossie says, "Oh boy, this can't be good." Vlasto says, "No, it's not. You guys are in for a long night," meaning it's not good results. You're going to lose. Yeah. Bossie wrote down the numbers and read them to Bannon, Priebus, and Kushner, who called Trump, who then told Melania. Jared says, "We're going to lose." This is in Bossie's book with Lewandowski.
And so that's a pretty big deal because at that point, obviously Manafort would have had those numbers as well and knew exactly what to do with them. So when you put all this together, and then after that, these states where Hillary Clinton had been polling ahead and was ahead, and they were told at 5:01 that she had won them, something happened that night, didn't they? The magical unicorn numbers changed.
Let me just actually pause you there just to talk about these exit polling. I've been there at those networks when you get the results. These are exit polls. They're conducted by the networks as a consortium. Basically are polling people as they leave their polling booths every day or during their election day and asking them who they voted for. So by exactly 5 o'clock, you get the results of the elections. Pretty damn close is what you think it's going to be that night, unless someone changes the numbers somehow. But because of the exit polling being pretty broad-based and because of the previous polling you can compare it to, people tend to believe the exit polling as being very accurate. So I remember in 2008 when Barack Obama won, I knew at 5 o'clock that Barack Obama was going to win, even though we were still on the air till 11 o'clock that night. But we were able to prepare our next morning's broadcast knowing a little ahead of time who was going to win. Now, it's a big no-no, and I mean it's a serious no-no in those networks. You're not allowed to reveal the results to anybody. In fact, you're not even really allowed to reveal it to your staff. It's only the executive producers that are meant to know. So in this case, for Vlasto to be calling a campaign, regardless if it's a friend or not, but calling a campaign and briefing them on exit polling results is certainly putting him part of a conspiracy to defraud the people of the United States for that election. It's a very complicated.
The polls were still open. People were still voting.
Yeah. 5 o'clock, there's nothing in the East Coast. 5 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock in the West Coast. People have plenty of time to vote there. And even in the East Coast, polling stations were still open. So having that information would be very useful. It would be even more useful if you knew all the other polling. If you knew what Manafort gave Kalimnik, who was a GRU asset that he had worked with before in the Ukraine, he handed over to Kalimnik lots of of polling results that they'd internally done for the campaign. So they knew which states they were going to likely be losing in, which states were going to be close. If you had those and you had the exit polling, then if you were Russia and you had access to some of these servers that ran these elections, which we know now they did, then you could
While the
actually
votes are
affect
still being
something.
counted and being cast. I want to make that point. That's important.
Because you could just send people over. You can even just send people to the polls and just say, we need more of you. You know, you're so close, we need more. But in this case, it could have been, I think, judging by the breakdowns, as we see in those three key states, and I think you pointed this out, that it's really Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those were the number of votes in each state that really took Donald Trump over the top. And remember, Clinton won the election in the popular vote very, very handily. So it's remarkable that Donald Trump was able to eke out a victory here. And this is how he did it.
Right. With just the right number of votes, you know, the right number so as not to trigger an automatic recount, but enough to put him, you know, over the finish line so that he would get just that right combination, slice and dice, very surgical, right combination of electoral vote to put him over the finish line with the Electoral College, even though he had lost the popular vote, as you noted, by 3 million. So again, when you've got Manafort giving Russia the internal polling before that, so they could kind of knew where they were going, and then the night of, while polls were still open, while votes were still being tabulated at 5:01 to get that information so they can go in and do what they needed to do. Now we know then if you talk to Jennifer Cohen, and she's very good at this, and she can go through and say they've greatly improved the voting machines, not completely, but it would have been very difficult. Plus, people were on the watch in 2020, which is why Trump panicked and they had to, paper votes, paper ballots were such a threat to them, which is why DeJoy was so obvious. But in 2016, I believe that this is what happened because nothing else makes sense. Everybody was shocked that night. And the fact, in their own book, the fact that they didn't say, oh, it's close, or no, that makes no sense because we have other information that says we were winning. They all acknowledge, yeah, we lost. And it didn't surprise them. So the fact that something very odd happened after that is the problem.
I also, it should be noted as well that when the people did compare the actual results to some of the exit polling, particularly in Wisconsin, it seemed that all the unusual results that popped up, the stuff that didn't make sense in terms of the results not actually matching the exit polling, showed up in precincts that had electronic voting and had gone overwhelmingly to Hillary Clinton. So if you look at Wisconsin, it was just 22,000 votes that needed to be changed there. Just a third-party candidate there in each of these cases, Gary Johnson, getting between 2.4 and 3.6% of the vote. That's enough of a margin there to fiddle around with those numbers, to fudge around a little bit, take some numbers of his victories, of his votes, and add them to Donald Trump. It's kind of easy to do if you had access to those polling, and no one would be much the wiser for us because
exactly undetected. Yeah, as Karl Rove allegedly told a whistleblower, that's how it would work. But they didn't rely just on that. What they do is they take all these other measures to make sure that they can get, and this is what we saw clearly in 2020, Trump taking all of these measures, just blatant voter suppression and everything else they were doing to try and bring states as close to that magic 3% as they could. And so they do all of these other things to try and get to that point, to try and set up a situation, fertile ground, if you will, so that on election night, they've got different combinations that they can put together with states that are within that 3% margin where you might be able to do some funny business undetected. It's not like they always knew it was going to be those three states. They want to increase their opportunities and their options to make sure there's fertile ground to take whatever, I'm sure they have various measures in place, but this is what I think when you connect the dots. I mean, we're not stupid. I think it's pretty clear this is what happened in 2016.
I think so. And what you're pointing out is really important for everyone to think about. It's not just one strategy. It's about suppressing the votes first, bring it as close to as possible to that 3% margin that you point out that Karl Rove said you can cheat within. And then on top of that, layering on as much polling and information data that they can, probably illegally get out of the system in order to fudge the final votes, whether you do it in real terms, in people showing up at the polling stations, or whether you do it electronic, which is what seems to have happened here. It does seem to me like this is the strategy of the Republican Party, whether it's 2016, 2020, or going forward. This seems to be how they intend to try and win, is by somehow rigging the votes in their favor.
Right. And that's why you've got heroes like Mark Elias out there, state by state, fighting these battles against all the voter suppression laws, because they will do everything, every single measure that they can take. And now they become more bold because they've seen Trump get away with this stuff for so long. Blatant voter suppression, racism, that goes along with the open, white supremacism and trying to suppress the black vote any way they possibly can. So it's voter suppression. It's making sure there aren't paper ballots. I mean, everything they can possibly do, making it as difficult as possible for people to vote and as confusing as possible. And, they'll do the same thing again. We just found out that while Louis DeJoy is gone, basically the board or whatever it is just elected somebody just like him, or at least, somebody on that side. So we're not safe from that because they've planted this all around. And then, Trump has always felt that he had anything he could take to the Supreme Court that mattered, they would fall on his side. That's why you stack the courts.
Exactly.
So this was
thought
very
about
methodical.
every stage of this. They've really thought about how to rig every stage. And that's what's terrifying going ahead. Matt Foso says that the oft-repeated no tallies were changed. Got to revisit that now. And I think actually that's a good point. We were all told from, I don't know where, it just sort of came down. The results were right. No tallies were changed. But I don't know where that originated from. There was no official statement, I don't think, maybe. But
Well, they didn't order any audits. That's the election that they should have audited. And Hillary Clinton should have gone for some recounts. And for some reason, everybody was maybe shell-shocked. Maybe they thought there's nothing we can do about this now. It'll tear the country apart even more if we push for something like this, or it'll make her look like a sore loser. Because at that point, we didn't know all this stuff about Trump and his thugs and what he was capable of. We knew it was bad. I kind of knew more than other people because of some things that were done to me, which I've talked about pretty openly. But, and people were saying that night, we'll get through this.
Yeah,
we will somehow, it's going to be difficult, but we will survive this Trump presidency. And here he's been defeated, but I don't think we can say that we survived the Trump presidency.
Well, we are still
Far
living
from
it.
I think we're in trouble. And until we see some indictments and justice and some accountability, and the fact that we're not, that's what's bone chilling, because
I agree with
this
you.
is not over. Yeah.
I agree with you, because what we're seeing here is a pattern, right? If they did this in 2016, if they did it in 2020, guess what? They're going to do it in 2024. It's just the nature of who they are. It's just how they're running things. Sharon points out, just like he muscled Raffensperger to do in Georgia, and you're referring to when he said, we need to find, 12,000 votes, whatever it was in Georgia.
Find 11,000. Yeah.
Yeah. So very similar.
Well, you found votes. Yeah. They found 77,000 votes on election night in 2016. So this is what they do.
Exactly. And then David says Rosenstein, NSO versus WhatsApp. So, Rosenstein landed up leaving the DOJ after overseeing the Mueller report and overseeing this investigation, and right into the arms of an Israeli tech firm that hacks people's cell phones, at least the legal firm that represents them. So that's interesting. Andrea says, this isn't news. I would like to know why the media never spoke about this. Very disappointing that Obama pushed Hillary to concede. He must have known something was up with Russia. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we know he definitely knew that. He knew about Flynn. Again, I just think this was so big that a lot of people still can't get their head around it. When we talk about some of these obvious things, as we do on your shows, Ev, and have always, there's still that crowd that's like, oh, that didn't happen. This is tinfoil hat conspiracy stuff. And it's like, no, it's really not. Yeah. And as you know, I'm somebody that worked on Capitol Hill in senior positions for a very long time, for many years, in a different time, in the before times. And I was an RNC spokesperson, and I've run campaigns, and I've sat around the conference table in the Roosevelt room, in the Bush White House, Bush too. And I know these people. So for me to kind of say that I believe that this is what happened is kind of a big deal. I'm not some wild conspiracy theorist out there, trying to get eyeballs on my blog or something like that. This is just, I know the players, and it's chilling and it's frightening. And as I said, we're not done by a long shot. And until we see Trump held accountable, and that means indictments, we have to assume that we're still in trouble.
And, even if the Mueller report left a lot of things out and a lot of it was redacted, the Senate Intelligence Committee, Volume 5, is very definitive about a lot of these things. And you can't really read that assessment and say that this didn't happen. It's clearly happened. And so there's a lot of evidence to prove that all of this happened. The mail-in votes made all the difference in 2020. Indeed, they did. But what are we going to do this time around now that they know about the mail-in votes? We can't keep changing the system. And as they keep trying to suppress votes by these local state laws that they're putting in, it becomes very hard to outrun their rigging attempts.
Yeah. And they're installing a lot of their people at the local level to get this stuff done. And I've never seen anything like it. You're always going to have bad players, bad guys. The people that were signing their names, the forgeries for the false slate of electors, they're doing it proudly on video. I mean, this is a cult. These are people who really think, they believe believe this stuff. I mean, there's been such a psych ops done on people where they're willing to do things that perhaps they never would have been willing to do before. I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of just how deep some of that goes and how these people were convinced that this was okay. Is it just Fox News? Is it just Tucker Carlson?
You know, we're looking at an entire ecosystem. And the other thing, just going back to what you were talking earlier on about Manafort, I mean, Manafort was sent to the Ukraine to basically do exactly the same thing. You know, the same thing he did with Trump, he tried to do in Ukraine, where he got the right-wing leader there. But, you know, very basically, Oleg Deripaska, the Vladimir Putin oligarch, hired Manafort in the same way he did to do work in the United States for $10 million a year. He hired Manafort to do the same in Ukraine. And it's in Ukraine that they landed up appointing this unknown politician who was sort of rough around the edges. They redid his character, and he finally got elected as the president of their country. After 4 years, he was eliminated after a big revolution there. But the same people that did that, which is basically Manafort, you see circled there, Konstantin Kilimnik, who's on the very left circled there. There's not many pictures of him, but we know now he was a GRU, basically a Russian spy, a Russian operative. And then Rick Gates and Tony Fabrizio. Those are the people that they did that in Ukraine with. And then 2 years later, after the Viktor Yanukovych was removed from power by the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in 2014, 2 years later, they show up backing the Trump campaign and working for the Trump campaign in the United States. Also working for Deripaska. We know that because that is the conversation that we know Manafort had with Kilimnik about sending over polling results, about updating him and briefing Deripaska whenever he wanted.
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious, right? I mean, you can't look at all of this and say Manafort, just working independently. He was not. He was working for Deripaska.
Yeah, of course not.
And
of course
over
not.
polling
And that's why
data
Hillary knew that Trump was Putin's puppet. She said it. She was right. I want to go back to something one of your viewers, when they had they posted it about why are we just learning about this stuff about Vlasto, Chris Vlasto, and what he did. Why didn't the media report it? Well, he is the media, and they circle the wagons around him. And as I found out, you cannot criticize the media, the top media execs, because you will be silenced. You will be blacklisted. And even print reporters, they need their TV segments for their own careers. And so nobody's going to do something that's going to anger or ruffle the feathers of the network and cable net TV executives. And so that's why the media did not jump on it, because they're all friends with these guys. They do protect each other. It is clubby. And there's green room relationships. Yeah.
Also, that's why I started the show off by talking about Vlasto's grandfather and great-grandfathers, because these are institutionalist guys. They come from, Greek Orthodox Church and money probably, and also the Greek Orthodox royalty, the monarchy. That's where their roots are from. So you know that this is the type of people that they are. And Vlasto did not get fired from ABC News for this egregious thing that he did. I mean, he went on to not only get a promotion to, I think, Vice President of Investigations, which is a big deal at ABC News. But he also hosted this podcast called The Investigation about the impeachment. He did a live podcast every day for 50 days about the impeachment, which is decidedly pro-Trump, as you can tell from that poster over there. So, if I did that, I would have been fired pretty quickly at any news network. I'm surprised Vlasto did not get fired for leaking information of such magnitude and getting in trouble on a national stage and getting away with it. It's kind of stunning when you think about it.
Yeah, it's stunning when you look at the things that someone on broadcast news, in political news, can get fired for versus the things that they can't, or why somebody can get blacklisted. I found out you do not tell the truth about Donald Trump and that super PAC that he had. And that's how I got blacklisted, because Trump wanted me silenced because he had a super PAC. He lied to the Washington Post when he said he didn't. But this is where all the money was supposed to come in. He was not a billionaire. He wasn't self-funding. And as a result, because I remember I got the call on a Saturday night network, one of the three network news, one of the producers calling me and said, because of this, Trump canceled his entire weekend schedule. They're all flying back to Trump Tower and meeting, trying to figure out how to handle this because they were in a panic. And they ended up, shuttering the super PAC, which of course they had nothing to do with and didn't know because it was somebody that, the guy had been seen in Trump Tower. He's a friend of Lewandowski. So, yeah. I
feel for you. And I went through a very similar situation when I was there at CBS News for a couple of years. The minute I started covering LGBTQ right movement to legalize gay marriage, I was told in no uncertain terms that I had to stop. And when I didn't, because, it was news, my job was to cover the news. How do you select what stories. That's not what news producers do. We meant to cover the news. I was fired for the same reason. So, there is political agenda in those networks, and that's how they operate, and they don't let you back in the club very easily if they do at all. And it's you pay a heavy price, and all these people know that.
Well, and nobody comes to your aid because when you're getting pummeled, they all step aside because they don't want to get splattered with the blood.
Right. Exactly.
And,
in fact, they pile on sometimes.
And that's why it sticks. Yeah, and that's why it sticks. Nobody comes and says, you were treated badly and you had to come back in. But yeah, that doesn't happen.
And I've had conversations with, Brian Stelter, who was a colleague of mine. And I said, how is it possible that you have not covered the fact that it was a Time Warner meeting that introduced Jared Kushner to Henry Kissinger and during Dimitri Sainz was there? How is it possible that, you didn't mention that Jeff Zucker was the guy who introduced them? How do you get away with that as the media guy at CNN? And, there's a gentle...
Because they can. And print isn't going to touch it because, again, they want their segments on CNN. And if print goes there, then, print reporters are the ones that do a lot of the breaking news and get a lot of the stuff. But they get their star power from getting booked on and getting contracts on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, that sort of thing. One thing that in one of the meetings when Manafort was giving that internal polling data to Kalimnik, they actually met at that 666 building that belonged to Kushner. And they left separately so that they wouldn't be seen together. So they knew that they were doing something secret that they weren't supposed to be doing. And they knew that the Kushner building was safe.
And it's not only the Kushner building. I think they met at I can't remember the name, but the top floor of the bar there. It's a Cuban bar. It's a known place for Russian operatives to meet. And Rudy Giuliani is the guy who, sort of holds court over there. So, yes, they knew it was safe and they knew that I can't remember the name. Anyhow, right there, you can Google it at the top of the 666 buildings where they hang out, the Russians, when they want to plot all sorts of things. Great having you on the show tonight, Cheri.
Building.
Yeah, in Jared's
Thank
building.
you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did, and there's so many connections between all this stuff, and it's why I think it's so important to not forget about 2016, not forget about the Mueller report, and not forget about the fact that this is an ongoing attack on our democracy. It started in 2015, has not ended. We're seeing it right now with the way the Republicans are acting in the House. We see it now with the suppression laws that have been implemented, then no backing of the voting rights bill. This is all suppression that's going on, and it's an attack on our democracy. We saw it in the 2020 elections, as we see every day from the commission as they release more and more subpoenas and more information. And we're going to see it, you can take my word for it, this year when we vote again in November and certainly in 2024. This is an ongoing attack on America. And to add another layer of it, it's not just coming from the inside. There's certainly countries on the outside trying to do it as well. And that just makes it even harder for us to contain. On that note, we wish you a very good night and thank you very much for being here. Thanks, Cheri. Always great to see you. Hope to be back soon. And maybe we'll do another one of these. We should do another Lost File, see if we can find one that's worth doing. And thank you at home for watching, and we'll see you again tomorrow night. Narrative is made possible by viewers like you. Join today and support truly independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. That's patreon.com/narrative.